Hello and welcome to the test screening. I'm Billy.
I'm Chloe. We're two film school graduates and cinephiles who can't seem to get enough of the big screen.
So now we're bringing you our weekly insights into the biggest releases, hottest topics, and forgotten classics every Monday.
Hello and welcome back to the test screening. My name is Chloe.
And I'm Billy.
What has happened this week in film, Billy? What are the juicy news stories? Give me the goss.
Well, the juiciest news story in my mind from this week in film news is that in conjunction with Disney laying off 3% of their employee load, 7,000 employees to be exact, despite the fact that they had, an 8% increase in revenue. So it looks like they're trying to cut costs here, despite, not desperately needing to. They've also announced Toy Story 5, Frozen 3, and Zootropolis 2. So it seems very much like they're looking to, their three biggest recent financial juggernauts in their catalogue. The past three entries in these franchises all three of them have passed $1 billion at the box office. In conjunction with them cutting costs, it looks like they're trying to, milk the most financial gain they can out of this.
Toy Story, why though? It
I
ended so
know.
well. And then it ended so well again, but not quite as well as it ended the first time. And I feel like we're just going to keep going with it until we get the shit ending that we all know it's heading towards. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, I don't even know if it can reach up to the standard. I mean, I can't even remember. Like, I enjoyed the fourth one, but apart from the spork, there's not much that I remember about it. It doesn't stand out in my brain anywhere near as much as the first three.
No, I would agree. I don't think it has nearly as many unique, standout, memorable qualities as the original trilogy. And it very much, even though I liked the way it ended and I kind of liked the way it wrapped up Woody's arc within the group and also his relationship with Bo and Buzz, it did feel very much like an appendix, like an epilogue to that original trilogy. It didn't necessarily feel like it fully connected with that original trio, I think, in the way they maybe intended it to. And I really don't see story-wise where they can go with it from here. And like you say, Pixar and Disney have been very, very consistent. Keeping on with the same franchise over and over, you're only going to be able to hit gold so many times with that. And also, with them pulling these kind of franchises out of the woodwork, it kind of seems like a bit of a regression to me because, one of their most recent entries, Turning Red, I just loved. I thought its use of the red pandas, adorable as they are, was such a original and visually inventive and fun way of examining young females going through puberty, and there was some really deep, emotive, complex thematic ideas.
It's just fun as well. It was different. I mean, Pixar has always been core of creativity. You know, we kind of see them as having all these original ideas, being innovators and coming up with things that you wish that you'd thought of, but also just really tight storytelling. And I kind of agree. I think it is a bit of a regression to kind of go back to these properties that they maybe didn't need to go back to. I mean, Frozen and Zootropolis, I can forgive a bit more. I mean, Frozen, that's not that much of a surprise to me, to be honest. I was pretty sure that we were going to get Frozen 3 at some point, and I kind of enjoyed the last one. I thought it was a bit messy, but I went to the cinema to see it on my own, surrounded by children, and I quite enjoyed it. And Zootropolis, I really loved. I don't know if they'd be able to, if a sequel would have the same kind of effect as the first one. You know, I'd hope that they'd kind of expand it and evolve the idea and improve on it and expand the characters. But whether or not they'll do that, it all just seems like a bit of a cash grab, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. You just go back to Turning Red, that the Chinese representation, the cultural representation in that, and the coming of age ideas it's exploring, it seems very, very progressive. And also, you go back to recent entries like Inside Out and the way that, in a really coherent, easy for a young audience to understand way, it unpacked, our emotional development as children, and also the way Soul looked at, so completely and thoroughly and entertainingly distilled ideas of mortality and kind of seizing the day and, living for the moment. It does feel like a move away from these kind of very progressive, thematically ambitious ideas that I think Disney has been trying to put out recently and really thoroughly achieving and being successful with on a narrative basis.
Do you think that this is a bit of the Disney Plus effect? Because obviously we're seeing less people going to cinemas for a start, especially for Disney content, because we know that it's going to come on streaming very quickly. I wonder what they're going to do with these releases, whether it's going to be that they're actually going to put them out in the cinemas for longer without moving them to Disney Plus, try and boost their income. Don't know. It feels like a strange way to make money when the main thing that they have at the moment is based on a subscription service. Whereas I guess the big money would come from prolonged cinema time.
Yeah, so something that happened recently, actually, and this might again have contributed to the decision to lay off employees, was I think there was a 2 million decrease in subscribers. They lost a somewhat sizable chunk of subscribers. So maybe the thinking is that in bringing out these tried and tested IPs and potentially giving them big cinematic releases and widespread distribution, that they will pull back another section of the audience, whereas another part of their customer basis seems to have dwindled. So maybe I can see the thinking of it there. But considering how much streaming is taking over, I do want, and also the fact that people may be getting fatigue from these franchises, being beaten to death,
Mm.
that I will be interested to see if it does have the success and reach the number of people that Disney is perhaps hoping for it to.
It sounds good in theory having Disney on its own streaming service because they've got the content to be able to do it, especially because they've bought out so many other companies. I guess the test will be in if it can survive amongst these platforms in its own right in the long run when they're also creating this new content themselves, which is in a way much more palatable, I think, to the streaming audience. I still think that Disney, in terms of what it creates for streaming, it's quite low quality compared to what it creates for the cinema. I think there's a really big disparity. Whereas with Netflix, I feel like the shows that they create for streaming are up there. Like there's a bit more differentiation between them. They have like a little bit more of a different look. They've got different genres. They've got more to pull you in. Whereas I still think that the Disney series, they're kind of samey to me. There's not enough to like make me want to pay for a subscription.
No, and I think that at the moment they're very much skewed, aren't they, towards the MCU, towards Star Wars, towards the Disney IPs, whereas Netflix are kind of doing it right, really. They're bringing in great directors. I mean, it's a film, but you had them going to the Martin Scorsese and the Safdie brothers for Uncut Gems and The Irishman, and with things like Stranger Things and Dark, they're kind of dominating in the sci-fi field. They're really doing well in comedy with Sex Education, which incidentally has wrapped season 4. Woo,
So
big
excited. I cannot wait. We're
big
doing a sex education episode at some
yes,
point, Billy.
absolutely, 100%. That's on the cards. But yeah, like you say, with their covering a lot of genre bases and bringing in a lot of very diverse talent, they're reaching a much wider audience, Netflix. And I think the content stream for Disney at the moment, I think, is just too insular and too pigeonholed towards a limited section of the audience.
Let's leave Disney behind us and go on to our first review. And we've got quite again a good mix of films today, Billy. Good job on your selection.
Mm.
So let's get as far away from Disney as humanly possible. And we're going to talk about women talking, and this is a Oscar contender, isn't it?
Yes, so double Academy Award nominee in Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Picture of the Year. Directed by Sarah Polley, who made a really terrific documentary called Stories We Tell, which I would recommend to any documentary fans, kind of looking at the way storytelling, even in a documentary context, can take on a degree of artifice and unpacking, what's real and what's constructed in a documentary context. Very good, very impressive piece of work. Women Talking is her next feature. It's based on a novel from 2018, which was incidentally based on a 2009 real-life case in an insular Mennonite community in Bolivia, which suffered a mass rape case in which a lot of women were drugged with a livestock tranquilizer and assaulted during the night. And when they woke up bruised and bloodied, and went to the men and were like, "What's going on?" They were accused. Well, they were accused of just being hysterical, having flights of hysteria-induced imagination, or that they had simply been targeted by Satan and demons. And that is the inciting incident for the film Women Talking here. And what essentially progresses to happen from there is that the men are eventually arrested after some of the women kick off in the community, and then they are taken away and by the authorities. But pretty much every adult male member of the community follows on to post bail for the attackers, and the women are left with a 24 to 48-hour window whereby they must decide how they are going to respond to this horrific situation. And they end up coming to three main points: stay and do nothing, stay and fight for change, or leave. There is a hayloft in the top of a barn on the community, and they essentially, that becomes a makeshift courtroom where they then discuss the theological and logistical implications of the circumstances they find themselves in. Now, a significant choice in Women Talking is to keep the assaults entirely off screen, only choosing to show the women realizing the severity of their injuries and their distress in the aftermath during the morning after. Sarah Polley has stated that she wanted to do this because enough violence against women had been displayed in cinema already, and more than enough, perhaps even too much, screen time had been dedicated to showing villainous men and villainous presences, and how those villainous processes are then fostered early on in life, and how those then develop into really venomous personalities. Why not spend more time understanding the survivors of their actions and their own experiences and the complexities of the situations they find themselves in? And in never showing the assaults in Women Talking, she said she was deciding to rewrite that narrative and alter the course of it around cinematic representation of female mistreatment, which I think is an incredibly admirable thing to do. And what it also says to me is that Sarah Polley and the film understand the idea that, for me, all the best films on this subject do. Films like Mysterious Skin, Promising Young Woman, The White Ribbon, and I May Destroy You, which for me is the key set text on this and just a televisual masterpiece. This idea is that uh, works where the abuse is either limited in visual detail or takes up little screen time, and it understands the idea that the true narrative weight and important, empowering thematic ideas in stories about abuse are not embedded in the physical brutality of the act, but in everything that happens around that act and how it is then responded to by the people who it affects. And it was really invigorating to see that this viciousness relegated to the abstract and the voices of the women brought to the forefront. One might think that, based on a cursory description of the subject matter and the makeshift courtroom of the hayloft, that Women Talking would appear inherently theatrical and be constricted by this limited setting, and be, very polemical and heavy on dialogue and quite dry and maybe somewhat dull. And this really actually isn't the case. In great judgments of how to adapt the novel for the screen, Sarah Polley has made some welcome expansions outside of the hayloft, where the women have their debate. It not only broadens the seismic impact of the story, and with her really deft directorial hand, she makes what could have been a really excessively stagey work into something that is, in my opinion, immensely cinematic and engaging as a piece of filmmaking. The geography and performative flow of the hayloft is really fluid. It doesn't have the rigid and schematic stage-like structure of like The Apartment in the Whale, which we reviewed recently and said was stagey to the point where it stifled the drama. The camera shifts in placement confidently, shifting in depth of field, distance from the actors, and the height of the angles to emphasize those shifts in power dynamic and the emotional fluctuations and deep subtextual implications of the women's points. And this makes the exchanges so much more detailed than just, theoretical speechifying. It has powerful visual representations of the points and events the women detail. When learning to vote, due to the fact they cannot read or write, they draw 3 pictures representing the 3 options and draw crosses underneath. When they talk about the crushing silence and grief that they're left in after having been assaulted, you get these incredibly stark, powerful images of empty barns, empty schoolrooms, empty houses, showing how, empty and how they've had the life sucked out of them. And the film's kind of grey and bleakly desaturated colour palette only adds to that effect. Hilda Gudendorf's score, which I think was criminally snubbed at the Oscars, I think a lot of people feel that way. It's used sparsely, but it's incredibly powerful when it appears. You get these metallic, warped clangs that invoke impending danger, whilst these tension-laden, kind of weeping strings and plucked melodies give a soulful presentation to the character's struggles, but also perfectly illustrate how desperately upsetting the whole situation is and added to how moving the piece was for me. At the center of it all, you have the stars of the piece, which really are the cast and the writing. The performances across the board from the ensemble are just outstanding. It's easy to single out, Claire Foy's unbridled rage and fierce protectiveness of her children as a standout, or the bitter defensiveness propped upon weary anguish from Jessie Buckley. But Rooney Mara's delicate optimism and effortlessly bright and shimmering empathy, Judith Ivey and Sheila McCarthy's authoritative yet compassionate prescience, and even Ben Wishaw's earnest desire to effect positive future change, are the perfect counterpoints to each other. There's so many great foils, and yet it doesn't feel, like a piece of, constructed, thought out writing. It all feels completely natural and genuine and authentic and in the moment. And the natural friction allows the performers to build off one another, heightening their emotions and deepening the complexities of the issues they discuss. The ebbs and flows in the debate are executed with total mastery by the actors. It really is, in my mind, one of the strongest ensemble casts I've seen in a very long time. The dialogue's also fantastic. It's very dense and the observations are very sharp about the various layers to the conundrum they find themselves in, detailing the various implications and impacts any choice they will have. But the dialogue always retains an incredibly potent humanistic quality. They're discussing at length lots of very introspective, lots of very philosophical and theological issues. And, when these are discussed in chamber piece dramas like this, oftentimes the characters may wax lyrical on a philosophical argument to such an extent that it feels like a regurgitation of a writer's thoughts and not a real person speaking. But the characters' verbal dissections of their desire to protect themselves and their children, their religion, their desire to seek forgiveness from God and maintain their chances of reaching heaven, but also find healing and better lives. They're so authentic. I keep coming back to this word authenticity, but it does just feel there's such truth in the writing and in the performances. And that balance between theological, the philosophical, and the personal is really well balanced. None, I think, receives, too much weighting. And that just, in the end, makes it incredibly socially relevant and socially pertinent to some of the issues that, women are facing right now in our current, social climate, but also just incredibly moving and super, super impactful. This is, I think, I haven't been able to stop really thinking about it since I saw it, and it really did just capture my heart, and it feels very, very urgent and important for right now. And like I said, it's just from a filmmaking perspective, expertly crafted. This is, I think, easily one of the best films I've seen of the last year. I would solidly put it in my top 10, and I would grade it an A+. I would give it my highest rating.
Wow, yeah, so an A+ film. Do you think it'll take home the Oscars?
I think perhaps it hasn't had enough fanfare to achieve Best Picture. I think it is. Some people might write it off as being too dull or too stagey. Those who don't really buy into the filmmaking mastery of it and also the performances. I also think there's more kind of conventional Oscar bait in there that is more kind of heartwarming. This, women talking is also very bleak and very emotionally draining. So I think there are more palatable works that could potentially take home the Oscars. I would love to see it get adapted screenplay though, because the writing is that strong.
Moving on then to, I'm gonna make a stab in the dark and say that this film isn't as well written. Knock at the Cabin.
As soon as you said, um, you know, not as well written, I knew exactly that you were going to say Knock at the Cabin.
This is
So
Shyamalan. This is Shyamalan, isn't it?
yes, this is M. Night Shyamalan, and I will definitely get onto the writing point.
Shamalama
But
Ding Dong.
yeah, this is
Oh.
his new, supernaturally tinged, home invasion-esque thriller. And whilst I wouldn't say it's without its flaws, I do think the general consensus of this being a return to form is actually warranted and kind of like harks back to when he was being touted as, making these novel fusions of Twilight Zone-esque stories with his Hitchcockian level of suspense. The story is that a couple with their daughter, while they're on vacation in a remote cabin in the woods, always a recipe for disaster, are accosted and have their home invaded by a group of people who say they are religious zealots and want to and urge them to say that they must sacrifice one of them in order to basically prevent the apocalypse. And they, of course, resist, and then a power struggle happens. And there's this very consistently maintained ambiguity as to whether or not these people are crazy and they've just, they are suffering from severe, psychological breaks, or whether that what they are saying is actually, you know, is actually on the horizon and impending doom is coming. So for starters, something I was pleasantly surprised about is that the film has a really terrific sense of place. The breeze and cicada song and the rustling of the woods, all being at the forefront of the sound mix and very resonant, it really helps to ground this story in a real and believable place, which then adds an extra sense of believability to the potentially fantastical situation as it feels strongly rooted in a um, believable location. And I mean, most of this film is set in a cabin. It appears, the past 2 weeks have been the episodes of the limited settings. But in comparison with something like The Whale, it's impressive how much visual mileage M. Night Shyamalan is able to pull out of this space. He's actually able to create quite a simmering pressure cooker environment in here, despite the fact the trailer painted this scenario as like ludicrously ghoulish. How could you ever generate tension out of this? It's ridiculous. But his camera work with is frequently creative, with really good use of negative space in the framing, blocking up the characters where they obscure each other and visually represent shifting power dynamics, off-kilter Dutch angles, unsettling pans and push-ins, temporary camera shifts upside down and top-down shots from the ceiling. He puts the camera in about every conceivable area and angle you can in this space without bombarding you with so many disquieting angles that you become numb to their disorienting effect. It's kind of smart from a structural perspective as well, by introducing the Dave Bautista character, who's one of the zealots, early on in this scene where he's kind of having this increasingly sinister conversation with the daughter outside the cabin. You kind of see this conflict within him and also in the other invaders, where they feel that they feel such importance and such reverence for this task and the desperation of the situation, that there is this conflict in what they are, in who they are as people, and what they're asking the couple to do versus what they believe is absolute necessity for the good of the human race. Now that being said, and also how committed the performances are from Dave Bautista, Rupert Grint, Jonathan Groff, and all the cast, really, they really do give it their all here. It doesn't change the fact that M. Night Shyamalan still has an absolutely tin ear for dialogue. There are many there are many, and that will come as a shock to absolutely no one. There are many moments in Knock at the Cabin where I found myself thinking, in what universe did you think that line sounded good and anything other than ponderously overwritten and excessively hammy? And the actors, bless them, do their absolute best to sell the dialogue, and in some cases they do more. I think more often, but more often than not, I think it does ruin entire scenes. You know, even with the heftiest and most serious of line deliveries, it can't stop some of the dialogue from being absolutely ear scraping. And there is also some screen time dedicated to the expanding of the backstory of the couple who parent the daughter, and its incorporation into the narrative is very clunky and ham-fisted and doesn't add depth or the emotional investment to the story I think it wants to. And it instead stretches the film to about 95 minutes, which isn't long, but I think at the 80-minute mark, I was going, yeah, you've kind of stretched this about as much as you can. But then again, you know, we always think of the Shyamalan, what's the twist going to be gimmick? And whilst, you know, no spoilers, I don't want to talk, you know, talk too much in that vein. I do think that I was impressed actually and pleasantly surprised by how he maintains that ambiguity and kept me guessing right up until the very end. And even then, I still think there's an air of ambiguity in it post having watched it. So whilst, like I say, it does have some, you know, some past Shyamalan growing pains that don't seem to have been discarded, I do actually think it worked somewhat better than I think some of his recent output like Glass and Old. And I would say it did just manage to skirt away from mediocrity for me. I would give this a B minus. I thought it was solid while it was on, if flawed.
I kind of have this like love-hate thing with Shyamalan where I think his ideas are great. Like every time I hear like a log line for one of his films, I'm like, ooh, that sounds so good. You know, like the concept of it or like the tension of it. It always seemed to just fall a little bit flat. And and it frustrates me because it's like, especially with something like Old, I kind of like heard what it was about and I was like, that's so interesting. What a different kind of idea. Like again, very Twilight Zone. And it's like a different kind of blockbuster.
And I do think the strength of this is that he's not necessarily relying in Old on this or Glass on these really kind of, you know, fantastical conceits and scenarios. I mean, that is here, but what really makes this, I think, work is the quality of the performances and those shifts in power dynamic and the fact that it is so character based. You know, we're not, you know, being strung along and, you know, drama artificially injected through like the characters aging or like a sci-fi injection into the story. It really is about, you know, what these uh, how these relationships change within these strenuous and Twilight Zone-esque scenarios these characters put under in this insular space.
Which I guess to me is more interesting, like what you're actually going to do with that concept and if you can actually deliver on that concept. So I've actually been quite excited for this one and I think I will be seeking it out to give it a watch. I must say that Jonathan Groff, I think he's a fantastic actor, but he always comes across a bit theatre kid to me sometimes. I mean, obviously that is his background. He's a musical theatre guy in Spring Awakening, and I mean, he was in Glee and all of that. So there's this kind of theatricality to him that sometimes prevents me from fully believing in his screen performances. I mean, he did very well in Mindhunter, but there was again still a little bit of, like the odd moment where his line delivery would get me as like, oh, that's quite theatre.
Yes, a little bit. I do agree with you on that about him. I think his way of emoting is very kind of pointed and a little bit more heightened than I think the other performers that he's generally cast alongside. And whilst I do think it's becoming more natural the more I see on screen, I would say that he's a little bit guilty of that here. But that doesn't necessarily mean I think he delivers a bad performance. It's just a certain quirk of his acting style that maybe takes me out of the moment every now and then, but I don't think necessarily makes me adverse to him as a screen presence.
Okay, on to our. I think this is another biggie. So, Blue Jean.
I've been so excited to talk about this one. So this won big at the BIFAs. It won for its screenplay, two of its performances, and I think it won even best debut feature, the best debut feature award at the BIFAs, the British Independent Film Awards. That is, for anyone who doesn't know. It's a British drama set in the late 80s in northeast of England, in Manchester, I believe, during the time at which Section 28 legislation was trying to be put through. This was legislation that, whilst homosexuality wasn't outright illegal in the UK anymore, the outright promotion of it was trying to be made illegal, which is just
Capture, isn't
frightening.
it?
Yeah, just reprehensible and incredibly frightening that that actually happened in fairly recent history. Only about 12 years
It was only,
before I was born.
wasn't it only 2003 where it was actually revoked?
Yeah, shocking. But I mean, considering some of the laws around the LGBTQIA plus community that are currently trying to put through that restricts their rights, a story like this seems more relevant now than ever. So, essentially, centers around a woman named Jean, who is a closeted lesbian. She is a PE teacher at her local school, and given the rising of this legislation, she is considerably wary and afraid of being outed and potentially that impacting on her career in a negative fashion. She's also conflicted because she herself is not, I think, as comfortable in her own skin and her sexuality as, say, her partner is. Her clothing, for example, is much more muted. Her partner, wears these very eye-grabbing piercings, spiked leather jacket. She has a lot of tattoos, shaved heads, and a lot more eye-catching in her appearance. Whereas Jean is kind of more reserved. And there's a student a new student at her school that she sees being bullied and being accosted for the fact that she is also gay. And when that student then starts to hang out in the same kind of areas and bars and clubs that Jean does, she kind of feels as though, that hostile environment and potentially dangerous environment of the school is then sort of encroaching on and bleeding into her social life where she feels safe and accepted. And it's about really her complex relationship with that and how that develops. And from top to bottom, Blue Jean just does so many things right. I mean, for starters, Rosie McEwen, who plays Jean, is just her performance is extraordinary. So much of the drama is built out of her internal journey, what the character is going through, and she completely embodies the various complexities of that unseen war and the different shades of Jean's personality. She has the angular facial features and very striking look of somebody like Tilda Swinton. She very much reminds me of her, but she has a very quietly expressive face as well. She never emotes to an exaggerated degree, showing great instinct, I think, as a performer in how subtle facial shifts or a single unwavering facial expression can tell us so much about how her character is responding to a situation without revealing too much or rendering her performance as anything less than completely genuine. She brings an inquisitiveness, a cold, steely reserve, a softly youthful energy, this tremulous anxiety as well, and I think a concealed, slowly suffocating pain. It's such a richly nuanced and detailed performance, and I think her BIFA win was richly deserved. It's also great to report that the film itself is as immensely detailed as McEwen's performance. There's really well-judged, understated symbolism with the somber uses of colours like the titular blue and her clothing to show, the main character's muted self-expression. There's this there's this opening scene that brilliantly lays out the key theme of identity and appearance as a reflection of that in the opening scene of Jean dyeing her hair blonde. It's funny actually that the font of the opening credits and the title actually really reminded me of the font used in the titles of Portrait of Lady on Fire and Petite Maman. And I think Blue Jean actually, interestingly, beautifully evokes that spacious and atmospherically poetic examination of gender and sexuality and identity that permeates a lot of Celine Sciamma's work, and what a great director to invoke the style of. The direction and cinematography are also really effective. The camera work is very intimate and tactile. It helps to envelop you in the relationships on screen. It's also really nicely tethered to Jean's perspective, so we feel strongly connected to her point of view. But the perspective isn't so rigid or tightly linked to her. to the point where we would lose, as an audience, our macro view of the wider narrative and situation. Georgia Oakley, the right director, she's got a great eye for the 1980s Northeast England milieu and atmosphere of the time. You absolutely feel the particular cadence of that place and time. And yet, due to how elegiac the feel and tone of the whole film is, the ideas and examination feel very contemporary and pertinent to right now, which is important considering the timing of the release and what's going on in UK law at the moment. It looks fantastic. The soft grain and noise of the celluloid helps to give it this really, like I said, tactile feel I mentioned earlier, but also make it picturesque in the sense that several shots have this really exquisite, luminous nostalgia, which I just loved. And I must also commend Oakley on how well written the screenplay is. In amongst the drama between uh, the in the moment on the surface story, you get really nicely timed shots of comedy, but also greatly judged externalizations of the subtext, the subtextual significance of the situations to these characters. But they're never, there's never a situation where you feel like too much attention is being called towards it. It's built into the fabric of the narrative really, really seamlessly. For example, when Jean's student starts to frequent those same clubs and socialize her within the group, it's complex in how it muddies the student-teacher relationship waters, but also creates inward friction and how Jean sees that ingrained homophobia of the school environment invading the space where she feels comfortable, and it makes her feel threatened.
Just hearing you describe it, it kind of like brings this up for me. Have you ever seen Handsome Devil?
No, I haven't.
I think it might be on Netflix. It's Andrew Scott's in it, and he plays a teacher. Um, and it follows the relationship between two boys at a boarding school, and they kind of realize that they have feelings for each other. But then one night they go out to a bar and they actually see Andrew Scott's character at the bar. They found out that he's gay as well, and I from it's quite a simple little film, like a little indie film, quite feel good. But yeah, sorry, that just brought that up for me because I can remember kind of enjoying the conflict that brought up in the teacher character and kind of exploring that world when you have to be hidden and there's nowhere else you can go, how those like lines can get muddied.
Yeah, I think if you enjoyed that, then in that case, you would really, really love this because, I mean, that is just at the heart of everything that's going on here. And I love it. I love dramas where the conflict is so internal and then that is kind of mirrored in the external surroundings of the character. I just think that's really intelligent, dramatic filmmaking and writing.
I think we both know that I'm gonna love this regardless.
Yes, I think so. It's
It
very
does
kind
feel
of
like a very me movie. I mean, also, I'm just happy that there's not a lot of queer representation that focuses on queer women.
no,
Um,
no.
we usually get we've had a lot of fantastic films about gay men or bisexual men, all of which I enjoy. And but the lesbians and the trans women and non-binary people, we are like a bit of a subsection, and we get even less representation than the rest
Yes.
of the community. It's really nice.
Yeah.
I mean, one day, I feel like we're getting closer and closer to modern day here. It's not a lesbian period drama, but we're getting closer. Someday we'll have something set in modern
Yes.
day.
Yes, 100%. We're progressing. It's a definite step in the right direction. If I have one complaint about Blue Jean, it's that sometimes the thematic seams and stitches of the screenplay are perhaps more apparent than I perhaps would have liked. You know, there's such nuance and subtlety in other areas of the script that when there's a radio or TV news report of the legislation that's being pushed at the time to ban the promotion and education on homosexuality hanging in the background, or some interactions and dramatic developments between Jean's students and her echoing plot machinations from previous coming of age dramas, or one scene between Jean and her girlfriend, and or another scene between Jean and her nephew, which stand out in this respect too. Like, oh, so okay, I've seen this before. However, even when particular scenes have an air of artificiality about them, the writing is of such nuance and authenticity that the film avoids reaching for any emotionally, cliched fever pitches, even for when it might look like it will for a second. And for this reason, the scenes ends up working and not standing out um, like they would otherwise. The writing of the characters is of such quality that the way they respond to these situations feels completely natural and doesn't smack of a screenwriter trying to clunkily facilitate unnecessary plot development. Really everything in Blue Jean is pitched at just the right register. It's never exaggerated, but it's never so understated that, you know, the subtext is murky, and that it can't be pulled out by an actively viewing audience member. I thought this was just terrific, excellent, really from top to bottom, and I think a definite 2022 highlight again. I would grade this an A. This was great.
2 A's in one episode.
Oh well, Women Talking was an A plus. We got an A plus and an
Oh,
A.
A
We're
plus.
doing
Okay, A plus and an A. But that's still, that's still pretty high praise. We've got a
we're
good
doing well,
one. We've got a good roster this week.
and we're not done
Um,
yet.
and we're not even done. Right, so next up is EO, which is about a donkey.
Yes. So this is actually based off a Robert Bresson film, which I must confess I haven't seen, but I think it's just important to point that out as well, the intertextuality. A Polish drama about, like we said, a donkey named EO, who at the start is used as a circus act, but some Polish legislation that's brought in sort of takes him away from that. He is repossessed as part of, trying to give the animals a better life and a better future. But the people who he ends up being taken to don't exactly treat him with the utmost care. He escapes and he embarks on this very kind of offbeat odyssey through the Polish landscape, and is kind of, I wouldn't say he is used as a plot device, but I do think he has some character to him. But EO really is his the donkey traveling through the landscape is really a way of noticing the varying degrees of humanity and the difference in attitude towards animals, which I think is a key theme of the film, are our attitude towards the natural world, animals, and also animal cruelty. One of the biggest strengths of EO for me is how it frames the donkey with relation to how we as viewers will then respond to its presentation on screen. The cinematography often features shots from EO's point of view, and the camera movement is sometimes very closely shackled to the movement of his feet, for example. But the film also features very many experiential expressionist views of the environment that have an omniscient quality about the perspective. And what that then does is it creates this wonderful balance of characterizing and fleshing out EO as having kind of an interesting, uh, in inverted commas, personality, but also giving us a blank canvas to anthropomorphize him. We cannot exactly know what the donkey character in the film or the real life donkey that was being shot on set were feeling during shooting, but we can project our own thoughts and ideas about what they may be feeling in a given sequence. It's a really great blank canvas and a really smart method of using cinema to influence an audience into actively generating empathy for an animal on screen, in the same way we should be exercising that in real life and expressing that empathy towards the natural world. And it works brilliantly alongside the film's key themes of animal cruelty. I think the formal approach encourages us to actively empathize with the animal and get us to think about how we respond to them in our own experiences and how we maybe should strive to treat animals. It's also significant when you consider the overarching structure of the story, because it's very episodic in nature. He's with a family who treat him very well and with a lot of dignity and a lot of pampering, for example, a lot of hay, a lot of cuddles. But at the same time, he meets people who are incredibly callous and violent towards him. And but the point is that it all, despite the episodic structure, it all flows very nicely. It doesn't feel stitched together, and the filmmaking is so daring and majestic and expressive that it all feels very cohesive and not disjointed at all. From a formal filmmaking perspective, it's incredibly dramatic and grand and stylistically adventurous. You get these pulsating red lights and swirling aerial shots used to signal the feeling of danger. Gorgeous portrait angles of EO situated in various different natural settings, unusual flights of abstract fantasy, and overbearingly harsh landscapes and monolithic presentations of these landscapes, and also really bestial, contemptful human characters. And the score is equally lofty. You get these gargantuan brass horn sections, these strange rickety synthesizers, these very luminous and liltingly serene pianos, and even a moment where the score is filled with what sounds like these really ambient multi-tracked reverb-soaked raindrops. It's really whacked out, but it all works so well. And because the score is as wildly experimental as the visuals, they do work together really, really well, and it feels very much of a piece. The sound design is also brilliantly used to show the discomfort experienced by the animals. Really abrasively loud, piercing metal clanging and deafening shrieks from the donkeys and horses in some farming environments that he's brought to, mixed so high in the leveled so high in the sound mix and mixed to sound like it's surrounding you, that we are really pulled into that fear and pain that the animals are being made to feel, which only again helps reinforce that empathy we should be feeling towards them. I wouldn't say every single stylistic flourish in EO works. There's a particularly disorienting sequence of rotating camera moves in a nighttime forest sequence that bordered on a little bit nauseating. There's also 2 insert sequences of a robotic dog and a person skiing upside down down a mountain that didn't seemingly have a lot of narrative relevance to the events that immediately preceded them on screen. The ending's also a little bit abrupt, but I think I've said this. I mean, I've definitely said this before, and if not on the podcast, in my musings to cinema about various friends and family, that I would much rather a film, swung for the fences and maybe missed a little bit and played it safe. And it's actually really remarkable how, considering the level of narrative ground and stylistic risks that EO takes, particularly in a very compact, just over 80-minute runtime, how much of it lands and how much of it works. So the complaints I mentioned just then are very minor, really, in the grand scheme of things. I was very impressed by this film as well. I think we're on for another A. This was a great one. I would recommend this highly as well, especially for animal lovers.
Nice. The cute donkey film is what I'm gonna start calling it. And yeah, animal lovers everywhere. This is the one for you.
It's somewhat. I mean, I say for animal lovers, it's somewhat just distressing in places, but I do think that its message about how we should be treating animals is something that will resonate with them, and also I think every audience member very, very strongly.
Talking of animal lovers, see that segue there? Do you see how good
That
that
was very smooth, very
Very
smooth.
smooth.
I
So smooth.
applaud you there.
Thank you. It was really smooth until I pointed it out. Anyway, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. So Puss in Boots, obviously the character from the Shrek films, came in the second Shrek film, became an instant fan, became an instant fan favorite, voiced by Antonio Banderas,
Legend.
legend himself. And I can't. Every time I just hear his name, I just think of Princess Bride. It's I can't not anymore. It's like, you killed my father, prepare to die.
Neo Montoya, you killed my father,
Yes.
prepare to die.
Ah, classic. Anyway, enough about him. Puss in Boots, what's that about?
So Puss has, been rip-roaring his way through heists and battles and, adventurous escapades, and has found himself on the last of his 9 lives. If he is, killed in another adventure, he will not be able to come back from it. He's been a bit careless, and he's kind of almost not embracing. Sorry, he's feeling his mortality and the impending end of his swashbuckling career, um, very potently, and he sees an opportunity with this kind of mystical, fantastical legend of a star that grants you a wish that he can potentially garner those lives back and gain a new lease on life, and that kind of brings him into another swashbuckling adventure with villains hot on his tail, taken from the fairy tale book. You get Goldilocks and the bears, and his name's Jack. He kind of puts his thumb in a pie. I forget his name, but there are some terrific
What
features
name is
by
Jack and he puts his thumb in a pie? What
I
the
can't
hell is that?
I can't remember. He is a fairy tale character. I can't remember his name. Um, Oh, that's gonna bug me
You know
now. What
what?
is it? Jack
Um,
Horner. Jack Horner. But
Listeners, if you have heard of Jack Horner, please let us know, because I've never heard of that. That's a new one on me.
I am fact checking it. Yeah, Little Jack Horner nursery rhyme. I am puts his thumb in a pie.
What?
Plum pie to
Okay.
be exact. Oh,
Well,
you
I'll
learned
take your
something.
word for it. Sorry, carrying
Uh,
on.
take Google's word for it as well. But yes, so you get some kind of very fun cameos from past fairy tale characters, also from the Shrek universe as well. And it's just great fun. There's a really terrific visual combination of the computer animated DreamWorks style of previous Shrek films, but also a crisp cel shaded texture that you get from something like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. It helps to keep the visual style varied. And the contrast makes it, very visually scintillating and gives the action sequences this lively comic book sensibility, which it actually enhances the clear Japanese anime influences of many of the fight scenes as well. One of the things that was actually a great pleasure for me in watching this was how cine literate Puss in Boots: The Last Wish actually is. Its sense of film grammar is very entertaining. There's a Mexican standoff sequence that clearly pays homage to the climactic firefight in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I mean, probably my favorites of these sequences. There's this exhaustion-induced fever dream montage laden in visual dissolves that's set to the ends by the doors, which is very clearly a hark back to the alcohol-fueled delirium sequence that Martin Sheen has in Apocalypse Now at the very start of that film. There's some, I know this. It's crazy. There's some shot-for-shot recreations of fight scenes from famous anime like Attack on Titan and Neon Genesis Evangelion. I mean, it's not exactly earning Puss in Boots points for originality, but it certainly gave it character for me and a sprightly, kind of witty, winking sense of humor. And I kind of enjoyed how self-referential it was in places.
Puss in Boots doing Attack on Titan is not something I would have ever put together, but if it works, it works.
I think it does. I think it does work. I think the action sequences also greatly benefit from a certain degree of restraint in the camera work. Rather than cutting at a blistering pace, the camera will often fluidly track across set pieces as characters move around the environment and are fighting each other, giving the excellent fight choreography some breathing room and gives us a clear handle on the geography of the altercations and doesn't make it makes the balletic nature of the movement and the attacks more gratifying and lends a visual clarity and coherence to the action there. In its latter half, The Last Wish also features an extended stay in a magical realm, and it contains a plot device, with no spoilers, but it contains a plot device that allows the geography of the world to change on a dime based on different characters' actions. And it's a really intelligent device because it allows the world to shift and contort and break apart in a way really that has narrative reasoning, but also facilitates some really creative choreography in the chase and fight sequences that make ample use of the changes in the landscape, which I thought was a very wise decision and very well done. It's really well paced. There's a graceful momentum to the direction that embraces the energetic bounce of the characters, but doesn't blitz through with such briskness that we sustain narrative whiplash. The characters, I do have to say, are somewhat lacking in depth, as I think is the overarching story. It's not the most engaging I think I've seen from an animated romp in recent times. The characters are also built out of fairly standard hero and villain archetypes. The partners that betrayed one another and come to trust each other again. The petulant villain who was ridiculed when young and has fostered a hatred for the world moving into adulthood. It's like, oh, okay, we've seen this. There's actually even a sequence that almost warranted a little bit of an eye roll. The messaging and wider themes are they're pretty tried and tested in children focused animations, and they're sometimes communicated these broad strokes ideas with fantastical locations that are named to represent that idea in a way that is a little heavy-handed. There's a point where they have to get through a roadblock, which is blocked by colossal sentient roses that are alive, and they must be passed by stopping to smell them, stopping to smell the roses.
Oh, that's okay. That's actually quite funny.
Yeah, it is funny. I can see the
That's
humor,
great.
but it was like, oh, okay. But despite this, um, and there's some of the obvious and arguably slightly stale plot leanings, the characters are so braggadocious and witty and brimming with infectious personality that it's hard not to become invested in them and their journey. And the dialogue is very sharp, and the voice performances by Antonio Banderas, they're so expressive and so filled with kinetic energy that it makes the later plot developments work and feel heartwarming, even if you can see them kind of coming from a mile off. It did still win me over by the end. There's also the character of Perito, a dog that Puss in Boots and Kitty Softpaws meet, is, you know, he's just he will win the hearts of, an entire generation. He's a great character, and the voice cast, Ray Winston, Olivia Colman, Florence Pugh, Salma Hayek, um, Antonio Mendez as well. It just is stellar across the board. Yes, I had whilst I wouldn't say it's reinventing the animation wheel, it's a really solid addition to the Shrek franchise, and I had terrific fun with it. I would give this a solid B plus.
When are we gonna get Shrek 5?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because there was a really in the screening I was in with the audience I was in, there was you could tell that there was a lot of love and excitement based around the fact that, Shrek really does still hold a big place in the hearts of, I think, our generation. People have a lot of still reverence and nostalgia and joy for it as a franchise, and a lot of good memories attached to it. And without spoilers, there's the final shot of the film so perfectly alludes to maybe a potential, expansion of the franchise in the future, that just made us all gasp with glee. It was a really lovely moment.
The Shrek cinematic universe. It's like Shrek gonna
It,
become like
it
Nick
is. It
Fury
is.
now and just show up at the end of.
The
That's
far, far away Avengers assemble.
wow. I didn't know I needed that, but now I'm hearing it, I think I do. Um, right, so that's everything for this week. Thank you, as always, Billy, for giving us your thoughts and opinions. You've been as wonderful as ever.
As have you, my wonderful esteemed co-host.
Nice, that is my job, yes. Right. So what have we got coming up next week?
So next week, I think we're going to tackle some recent. I think it's fairly quiet for new releases. So I think what we're going to do next week is we're going to tackle some more streaming releases. So we're going to in a first on the Test Screening podcast, we are going to be looking at season 1 of The Bear, Disney Plus series that's achieved a lot of critical acclaim. So I'm very excited to talk about that.
I'm enjoying
Also,
it very much.
yes, I know you're watching it now. I've finished, but I'm very interested to see what you think when you get to the end. Also, some Eiffel, starring, a historical biopic with Emma Mackey from Sex Education, which I don't ever think got a theatrical release in the UK, but is now on Sky. Also, a really terrific Indian-based wildlife documentary, All That Breathes, which is also on Sky, and 2 Disney Plus documentaries: The Territory, funded and produced by Darren Aronofsky's production company Protozoa, The Territory, that one's name is, and Fire at Love, which is nominated for the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. So a very interesting, slightly different lineup next week.
I look forward to it. So, as always, find us on Instagram, give us a like. There's a bit of extra content on there, and you'll be able to see what Billy's watching throughout the week. And with that, I bid you adieu. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you for listening.